my clock runs a little, seems to run a minute or so fast, but it's about 5 minutes after 2. So I think I'll declare this particular meeting in session. This one is a meeting after my own heart because it's at the confluence of cooking, history, and books, all three of which I very much enjoy and which I've been participating in for some time. Judy, are you planning to introduce Don, or would
I
you
was
like?
going to, unless you would like to. It's okay with me because
Uh,
you know you have a history with him. So why don't
Okay.
it's
Well,
fine.
our speaker today is Don Lindgren, who is the owner and the principal of an antiquarian book business by the name of Rabelais Inc., which is headquartered in Alfred, Maine. For those of you whose Maine geography is not very strong, Alfred is about midway between Portsmouth and Portland, not well, actually sort of between the shore and the New Hampshire border, very far south in Maine. And contrary to the usual trend in the book business, Rabelais actually has an actual honest-to-goodness office located in Portland. So if you happen to be doing summer in Portland and you want to go shopping for an antiquarian cookbook, there you are. Don's been in the book business for about 40 years. And his website says that he got started in dealing with 20th century art with an emphasis on avant-garde, which, as I told him a couple of minutes ago, is as far from antiquarian as I conceive of antiquarian as you can get. So if he doesn't actually say something about it during his talk, I'm going to ask him how those two got together. Don's been a governor of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association, which is the main industry organization for books, and has some of the most widely regarded and upscale book fairs in the United States. He's also a member of the International League of Antiquarian Booksellers, the Ephemeral Society of America, and the Bibliographic Society of America, which covers the areas of the things that he deals in. In terms of speaking, he's actually given a program at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, and he's spoken at the Colorado Antiquarian Book Seminar and the Rare Books Boston Seminar. In 2019, Don co-authored and published the first part of what he's planning as a multi-volume exploration of the American Community Cookbook, and it's titled Unexcelled: American Cookbooks of Community and Place. I'm eagerly awaiting volumes 2 and however many others there are planned. In his off hours, Don is a farmer, has a small farm, and I'm assuming it's Alfred, not Biddeford, Don.
Yes.
In Alfred, and lives with his dog, Lark. So for the spare time activity, if there is such a thing in that business. Don, all yours.
Thank you, Bruce. It's so nice to see you. Thank you for inviting me. Also, thank you to Cece Williamson, to Judy Mata, and to Carolyn Candries-Nason, who is very helpful in making sure that this goes smoothly. If anything doesn't go smoothly, it is entirely my fault and not hers. Two things I just want to say before I jump in. The first is that I'm going to kind of go back and forth between reading directly from an essay I wrote on this subject and then more casually addressing some of the photographs we're going to be looking at. So you might notice, you'll see some change in the way I deliver things. The second point is just that I realized after I had offered the name of American Community Cookbooks, eccentric yet powerful, I really would have preferred eccentric yet effective. And if it seems odd that I would say that these are eccentric books, I hope you'll be able to see why I think they are. And that's actually one of the reasons I'm so drawn to them, is that they're outside of regular publishing in many ways. And so you find aspects of these books that are range from magical to completely frustrating, and I love that about books. Books that challenge me bibliographically or historically are really what I love to spend my time with. So I'm going to jump in. I'm going to share my screen now, and I hope you won't mind looking at slides of books along with a much smaller picture of me, I hope. So, as I said, community cookbook, eccentric and yet effective. I'm going to start with some of the written material and then get more casual as we go. So for more than 150 years, groups of women have gathered around kitchen tables in church basements and in meeting halls to collect and organize recipes for a purpose more ambitious than their own use. They were doing the work of making cookbooks. To do this work, the women exercised all of the functions of commercial publishers. They solicited content, they sought financial backing, they edited, designed, and illustrated. They hired printers and binders, and finally they marketed and distributed their product. They accomplished this on a shoestring budget with little or no exposure to or guidance from traditional centers of publishing, and without the motivation of personal gain. The fruit of all this labor is a legacy of thousands of works produced by amateurs in the best sense of that word in towns big and small across the US, a distinctly American expression of fellowship, creativity, and purposefulness, the community cookbook. The community cookbook as a genre is generally considered to contain three characteristics. I think this is a proper definition of the community cookbook. The first is that the books were produced by a recognizable community. This is a great example because they're so specific. The Oakville cookbook of Oakville, Iowa of 1915, it's contributed by the ladies of Oakville, published by the Rose Circle class of the Presbyterian Sunday School. It's a group within a group within a group. So that the community itself is recognizable. The second aspect of the community cookbook for the definition is that the recipes are understood to have been gathered from within the community. They were compiled by whoever the group was creating the book from members of the community. It's worth noting that this does not mean that the recipes are inherently from the community themselves, but they're just supplied by the members of the community. And the third aspect, and this is such an odd picture, but I'll come back to this again and explain why this odd picture is in here, is that there is a charitable goal. We often see the books were used to raise funds to build a church, a hospital, to rebuild a steeple after it was struck by lightning, to purchase a pipe organ for the church, to address a material need like food banks or clothing, or to support a social or political cause such as women's suffrage or temperance. This is the 1880s women's suffrage cookbook. This was Hattie Burr. It was originally published in 1886, and then again in 1890, both used for sale at a fair to raise funds that would go towards women's suffrage. And this is a much more modern book from 1983, the LA Street Cookbook, which was used to raise funds for a women's center in Compton in Los Angeles. This is closer to what we think of when we think of a community cookbook these days. We think of these comb bindings. This is not a spiral binding, by the way. This is a plastic comb binding. And spiral bindings are almost exclusively metal, although sometimes there have been some plastic ones. But this thing with the teeth is called a comb binding. So once again, just to go over the definition quickly, they're from a specific community that can be identified. The recipes are gathered from members of the community, and there's some sort of charitable fundraising purpose to the book. There are some other elements of the book as well that we frequently see, but I don't think of them as generic to the definition of community cookbook. So some backdrop. The community cookbook doesn't come into fruition as a complete separate object in the cookbook world in America until 1870, and we'll see that in a second. There are forerunners of it, and this is the most famous one, which is the Poetical Cookbook of Philadelphia, 1864. And this book is considered incorrectly, unfortunately, but it's widely considered to be the first fundraising cookbook or first charitable cookbook. It turns out, thanks to the collection of someone that's listening to this right now, that there's information that shows us that that cookbooks going all the way back to the 1820s were explicitly used to raise funds. And Bruce, it was a book of yours that we first saw that indicated in a second edition, where someone had written a note in the on the title page of the second edition saying the first edition of this was used to raise funds for the such and such. $1,000 was raised, and this is a book from South Carolina, the first cookbook of South Carolina. And we did a little more research on that book after we saw Bruce's copy, and found newspaper advertising that explicitly said this is being sold for this specific purpose, and therefore we have evidence of a fundraising or charitable cookbook that goes all the way back to the 1820s, not just the 1860s. This is Nantucket Receipts. This is Boston, 1870. This is considered to be the first true community cookbook, and by that I mean it has all three aspects. It has an identifiable organization. It's not all on the wrapper here. It has a purpose, which is it's for the New England Hospital for Women and Children, and the recipes are gathered from members of the community. It's a slight little thing. I think it's 16 pages long. It's a miracle it survived at all. It's an extremely rare book. I've only seen one of them, which is this copy. I've never seen another one for sale in the last 23 years of selling cookbooks. I think I'm going to go a bit into how these books are yeah, I'm going to stick there. I want to discuss a little bit how they're eccentric before we move to how they're powerful or how they're effective. So back to my text, in this confining cultural and legal environment, and there I'm talking about the fact that the women producing these books at this moment in time, the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, they're at a period where they can't have a bank account, they can't take out a bank loan, they can't form a formal association, so they have to basically come up with a series of workarounds. There are three modern phrases I love to use when I talk about community cookbooks because people know these things. One is DIY. There's lots and lots of DIY in these books. Do it yourself. They're problem solving, and it's a lot of workarounds in order for them to be able to publish these things. The second word is crowdsourcing, and that has to do with where the recipes come from. We talked about how that's the second part of the definition. So they're reaching out to their community, bringing the recipes in, and we would call that crowdsourcing today. The third one is crowdfunding, which has to do with the way that the books were actually funded up front in order to pay for these things, and we'll hear a little bit more about how that was done. So in this confining cultural, social, and legal environment, this is talking about the limits of women's ability to deal in things like loans and contracts and money. How were they produced, and what did the women achieve? Some of these hurdles were overcome by dispensing with them altogether, which was a rare luxury they had because many of these groups existed outside of traditional publishing centers, so they just didn't pay any attention to some of the things we might think of as being a natural part of a book. So copyright registration, for example, that followed a routine course at commercial publishing houses at this time, but it was not consistently filed for church and charitable cookbooks whose distribution was only local, while books produced by social reform or relief communities such as the Temperance Union or the Women's Exchange Societies frequently did seek counsel regarding property rights and copyright. The uneven application of copyright registration led to some unforeseen consequences, including the exclusion of many community cookbooks from the holdings of important institutional collections. And this is a really technical thing. I'm not going to go into it too long, but it just needs to be said that the Library of Congress has a real issue collecting community cookbooks. I'm not saying they don't have any, but even the ones that were run through there for copyright are frequently excluded from their holdings. And that's not because anybody was trying to keep community cookbooks out themselves, but because of the nature of the way copyright was registered. And if they were to then go and buy, or if they couldn't even receive a donation of 500 community cookbooks, because they would be obliged to pursue copyright on each one of them. And it's a very odd thing. I've had long discussions about this with Mark Dimination before he retired, and it's fascinating. Again, not aimed specifically at community cookbooks, just something that has to do with the Library of Congress's charter and the way that works. Compilers and editors of community cookbooks applied somewhat vernacular standards to the rules of publishing. Title pages were sometimes absent altogether. I think that's a pretty frequent thing we see, especially with smaller books that would have been issued with wrappers. The wrapper contains the title and there's no title page. Wrappers, the title pages often were the info we would expect to find on a title page, including the printer info and dates and things, can also be sprinkled throughout the book. You'll have a title page and then with a title, and then later on there'll be the name of the printer and the binder, and then some other place there'll be the date. And in a way, it's kind of like going back and looking at the earliest cookbooks, at incunables in the late medieval and early Renaissance era, where those standards didn't exist yet, so they also have eccentric publishing practices. Here's the crowdfunding portion. Upfront and publishing printing costs were financed through a creative workaround. Advertisements were solicited from local businesses, including printers and binders. Barter for promotional consideration, coupled with advertisements for business within the community, helped finance the cost of book production, leaving the proceeds from sales to be applied in full to the charitable or social cause. And this was one of the ways that the groups of mostly women were able to avoid the whole issue of having a bank account, getting a loan to do this, and like. Not all community cookbooks contain advertising, and it's something we frequently see, and so we've come to identify it as an element of them. But I think it's a secondary element, because there's at least an even number of community cookbooks that don't contain the advertising, and those are probably organizations where somebody was willing to pony up the money in advance to cover the printing costs. An interesting thing about this is that in most communities in America in the late 19th century, when these were starting, there were printers and binders local to the community. As a matter of fact, Biddeford, which was where I had my old shop until last year, used to have 4 different printing and binding operations in the city of Biddeford. And across the river in the city of Saco, there are 3 more. And so these printers and binders may be associated with individual denominations, one with the Methodists, one with the Presbyterians, one with the Catholics. Sometimes if there was a synagogue, that would be later. But so the women would have somebody within their community to reach out to and say, can you help us publish this book? And the advertisements would come largely from other members of the same community, not just the town or village, but also the actual, and I'm talking a lot about churches, but the same things apply if you're talking about a Grange Hall or a hospital auxiliary or whatnot. Now, this is the crowdsourcing part. The cookbook's content, an expense for a traditionally published book, was compiled from within the community at no cost beyond labor, with recipes frequently but not necessarily attributed to the contributing member of the community. In effect, women employed techniques that we might be called, well, this is crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, etc. But so they would reach out to the community members would supply the recipes. I was part of a project which is now going on its 3rd volume, that started as the main community cookbook for its bicentennial celebration a few years ago, which of course fell in the first year of the pandemic. And we reached out to some friends of mine were publishing this, and I was involved in the historical part of it. And we reached out to people all over the state of Maine. The idea was that the entire state was the community, and we tried to get people from every county and from as many different types of Mainers as we could find. And I think we largely succeeded. But what was fascinating about that for me, as somebody who studies and reads and is interested in the history of community cookbooks, I suddenly was faced with, or the three of us were faced with the same challenges that every group that ever produced these were. And my friends are cookbook authors. I work with cookbooks, and neither of us expected this. What do you do when you get 5 recipes for the same dish, even if they're slightly different? What do you do when you look at recipes that come in and the formatting and the detail and the length of the recipes is widely different? How much consistency do you want to apply? There were all sorts of questions that we were like really sort of baffled by. And that's beyond the question of which of these recipes is just uncookable, it's unmakeable, there's not enough detail. So actually, I'm going to stick on that for a second longer. So sticking with the material of the books and people having to go to these local printers and binders, one of the things that happens is that the local printers and binders slowly close over time. And this is because, like with all businesses in America, consolidation is a major thing. So the 4 printers in Biddeford become 1 or 1.5, one printer, 1 binder. But now you'd have to go to Portland or Sanford and to get the printing done. You no longer have the personal relationship with a member of your community, perhaps your parish or congregation. So that aspect of being able to go to a professional printer and binder slowly evaporates. And this pushes people, this is something that starts to happen in the late 1890s and carries through till about 1920, when it's kind of somewhat completed. There aren't that many locals available, but they're forced to either deal with an entirely new type of printer that are these specialist publishers based now all along, they're largely based in the Midwest, and they do this type of fundraising cookbook publishing, and it's all they do. And there's one company out there in particular that's produced something like 10 million books. I mean, it's a crazy number of books and something like 20,000 titles. And they're all community cookbooks. And these guys are set up to be able to do just 300 copies of something or 500 copies, and they don't have to have the expense, the big setup cost that happens for these types of printers. So that was one of the workarounds that these women were forced to do. The second one was the one that's really interesting to me, is to go DIY, which means that they started to adopt new printing and binding techniques and technologies, and to use odd materials that were available to them to do this. So you see Mimeo and Ditto, and later on Gestetner and A.B. Dick machines, and eventually Xerox machines in terms of for the printing. And on the other side, for the binding, you see saddle stapling. You see books that are sewn on a thread. Somebody puts a grommet through the upper left-hand corner and runs a cord through that, or nuts and bolts, which is one of those strange connections between avant-garde books and community cookbooks. And the materials themselves are also very different. So in my collection, I have community cookbooks that are bound in materials including corrugated cardboard, asbestos, linoleum, wallpaper, printed, there's some examples of this we'll see in a bit, printed oilcloth, which is something that you saw frequently. You'd put it on your kitchen table because it was easy to wash. And burlap, and I mean, it goes on and on, like whatever was available. If Mrs. Smith's husband had the flooring store, then he had books and books of linoleum samples, and they would just cut the linoleum samples to page size, whatever that was, drill holes in them, and run a piece of cord or a ribbon or a bolt or those metal rings you could get at stationery stores. There's lots and lots of like repurposing of stuff from the stationery store. So, and this DIY thing it's just endless. It's really kind of exciting to see what they do. There are books I had that I was sure that this was an aftermarket binding, that somebody like put this weird material on there just to save a book from falling apart. And then I found a second copy of the same title, and sure enough, it was the same material, which then shows me that that book, that's how the book was issued. So, I think I'll jump into the pictures more. So with types of empowerment or effectiveness, it's like we think of these books and they, we think about the recipes and what they can supply us. People think about the genealogical information, but they rarely think about the fact that these books actually had real impact, that they were not just, something people did as a pastime, and it's kind of nice that they did it, but they actually, and especially if you were in the Midwest or the West, they had a real impact on the built environment. There are churches and libraries and other and civic buildings that were largely funded by the proceeds from these books. It seems rather unlikely, but I'll just tell you one story about this, which is the Monte Vista Library Association. And this was Monte Vista, Colorado. And the Ladies Literary Club of Monte Vista had established itself in August of 1885. That's a year before the town was incorporated, for the purpose of providing a public reading room and a lending library. At first, the books were housed in the rear of the general store, but sufficient funds were raised, in part through sales of a cookbook, to erect a building in 1895. Fortuitously, the building, if small, it was 16 by 22. It proved durable, and today it houses the archives of the Monte Vista Historical Society. In 1995, there was a report filed that included this narrative of the building. On Saturday, August 3rd, 1895, the ladies of Monte Vista Library Association gave their annual reception at the new library building. The San Luis Valley Graphic reports that the guests were invited to bring suitable books for the library, and the request was liberally responded to, and so on from the report. There was a fire that destroyed one of the buildings they built, but they applied and built an additional building in 1916, and that became what is now the Monte Vista Carnegie Library. And so they ended up building two successive buildings, which are still standing and still in use in Monte Vista, Colorado. And this was a small silver mining town. This was not a big place. I did work by going, and this was probably the least exciting part of the work on community cookbooks I've ever done, but there were, in the 19th and early 20th century, there are denominational periodicals that cover church building, and they're partially architectural and they're partially financial, and they explain the roots of the financing of many of the churches. And they'd say, oh, here's an example of a church that was built by such and such, it was designed by architect this, and pastor so-and-so was the first pastor to bring it to fruition as a church. And then here's the breakdown of the finances. And they would name the Ladies Auxiliary, which was usually either the first or the second largest amount of money. And they often did this while sending other money to a national congregational organization that was distributing church funds kind of equally everywhere. So there was a little bit of redistribution of that. So the first thing is that they produced the books. That itself is a sort of miracle and example of effectiveness. So the second is that they actually created real value, and they raised real funds that went to building things, including the built environment, a rose window in a church, again, a church organ, new furniture, the brand new grade school. And I don't think a cookbook would be able to make those kinds of funds to build a grade school these days, but it could in the 1890s. Another type of empowerment was to have effect on social movements that they were involved in. And, looking at the entire history of community cookbooks right up till today, you'll find cookbooks applied to every kind of political and social movement. And it's pretty shocking how far they go. There are anti-nuclear cookbooks in the early 1970s. There are anti-nuclear war cookbooks in the 1950s after the bomb had been used at the end of World War II. There are books that are encouraging changing of law, having to do with what we now call LGBTQ people. There's a famous Maine cook called cookbook called Out in the Kitchen that was raising money specifically to fight against a law that was anti-LGBTQ in 1992. So there's a lot of temperance movement, political movements, you name it. I've talked a little bit about the publishing and editing and the title pages and whatnot. This is a really, thorough title page of a Washington, D.C. cookbook from 1890 called The Way to a Man's Heart. And this is the Committee of St. Paul's Church Guild in Washington, D.C. This is the Gulf City cookbook, the first Alabama cookbook. And I love this ad that says, too busy taking in washing to write an ad. Go to Peerless Laundry. This is an example where the printer is the actual printer and binder for the book is hidden. And you see this a lot where the printer or binder gets an ad, but their name is not on the title page. So this was Ensley, Alabama, Steel Smith recipe for good printing. This is again another printer or binder ad that you'd find inside a book. And this one is saying like, ladies get all the credit, but they did use our printing because they think we're good. And this I had promised to show you earlier, or re-show you earlier. This is one of my absolute favorite things in my collection. It's a printed envelope that went on a Pennsylvania cookbook. It was called Franklin County Cookbook. I think it's 1915. And this is one of the clearest explanations of the whole process that I've ever seen. So the book itself would be in this envelope, and they would leave this envelope on your doorstep. And it would say, we're going to come back tomorrow for 25 cents or whatever. Yeah, 25 cents. We'll call again tomorrow for 25 cents. And if you want more, you can buy them then because we'll have more copies. It explains everything about who this is for and who it's by. It's by the housewives of Franklin County. And the recipes are there to support the children's home. And therefore, it's a charity benefit cookbook. It's very unusual to get information about the way these things are marketed and distributed. And that's true of lots of types of material. It's like not something we include on a book, except for the price and the publisher's name. But this is really exactly how the door-to-door process worked. I've never seen anything like this before, and I hope I find more of them someday. There's a legacy of the built environment. This is there's another thing to remember is the 1870s and 80s were the years of grand urban fires in America. So lots and lots of things needed to be rebuilt, and this was one of the ways of raising money for it. This is actually an anti-nuclear weapon cookbook from California in the early 60s. I always throw this in because I like to remind people that community cookbooks, because they're representing social movements around America, and they're not all happy social movements. So if you look at this picture, and this is half of the picture, you'll see the rest in a second, you'll notice the shoes, and these are clearly women's shoes. And but you might not notice the shoes first if I showed you the whole picture. And this is the women's auxiliary of the Ku Klux Klan. I believe this is a Pennsylvania group, and they did produce a cookbook. There are about a half a dozen explicitly Klan, KKK women's auxiliary cookbooks. And then there are other examples of things like this. This is perhaps the most I just think it's a very powerful photograph, but it was, yet again, one other piece of American society represented within the books. And so it's important to see all the history, not just the happy stuff. We talked about the advertising a little bit more. I think I got way out of sequence here. Some of the advertisements eventually became national advertisements. This is the Granite Ironware, which was a giant stamping company in St. Louis. They made all sorts of that thin, especially that blue and white stuff. I actually love the way it looks. And there was another company called Agate Ironware, and these companies were really big into advertising because they were mass producing this stuff and trying to get it out there into kitchens at a time when people were suddenly buying kitchen gadgets because kitchen gadgets were cheaper and more available than they had been before. This is an ad for the Walter Baker Company, their chocolate and cocos. Walter Baker was one of the biggest advertisers, along with Rumford and Horsford and a handful of other companies they spent gazillions of dollars on the material to basically get market share. It's very interesting. The biggest advertisers in food, and if you were to look at product books, you'd see that the biggest advertisers were all people who produced non-differentiable white or brown powders. And by that, I mean baking powder, baking soda, flour, sugar, cocoa, and some other things. Like if you went to the store, you used to buy it out of a barrel and they'd scoop it into a bag, like some natural food stores still do this. And so how do you gain market share in that? Well, you produce really fancy advertising materials and you put your ads everywhere you could possibly. And there's the fabulous book, is it the Baking Soda Wars? I have a name in my head of who the author was, but I don't want to say the wrong person. But anyway, it was a very serious battle for control of these marketplaces. This is an interesting one because they're actually putting these ads in color, and you do see I've seen one in the 1870s and a good number in the 1880s of color advertisements tipped in to otherwise relatively simple books. And then there's this thing I call mimicry, which I think is it's kind of the last straw in terms of proving that these books that they had power, that they were effective, that they were in the marketplace and in the kitchen, that they had real purpose. And by mimicry, I mean that there were product book producers, and Hood's was a big one, of Lowell, Mass, that were mimicking community cookbooks. So this is Hood's High Street Cookbook, a lesson in cooking, and this was actually was a book that was produced as a community cookbook, and Hood licensed it from the ladies of the High Street Church of Lowell, Mass, and then put it out with their own title, with their own wrapper on it, saying it was Hood's. So they recognized that these things were considered trustworthy, and there's nothing greater in advertising than to show your client, your target client base, that your product is trustworthy. So to identify your product with people in a charitable community cookbook is to say, look, this is very trustworthy. This is something that you should buy. And remember, as far as advertising goes, cookbooks, especially ones with the little tiny strings in the corner that you could hang on a nail in your kitchen, it means that just keeps your product name right there in front of the woman of the house for as long as it hangs on that nail. It's a very effective tool. And there's the title. That's the bottom of the title page, which was Ladies of the High Street Church in Lowell, republished by permission and copyrighted by Hood of Hood Sarsaparilla. There's another very famous example of this. See if I can get to it quickly. And that is what's known as the Buckeye Cookbook. That's a book a lot of people have come into contact with because there were so many different editions of it. It started as a church cookbook in 1876 in First Congregational Church of Marysville, Ohio. And then two of the people within the congregation bought the rights to the book. It was Estelle Wilcox and her husband, Alfred Wilcox. They bought the rights, and they created the Buckeye Cookery Publishing Company, Buckeye Publishing Company. And they put that book out under a number of names, including Buckeye Cookery, Practical Housekeeping, the Dixie Cookbook, the New Dixie Cookbook, and finally, once again, Buckeye Cooking. The greatest example of what they were up to here was the Dixie Cookbook, where they moved their publishing to Atlanta, Georgia, in time for the Southern States Expo, which was 1885, 86. And they put out the Buckeye Cookbook, now called the Dixie Cookbook. It was all recipes from Ohio, except for an 8-page supplement in the middle of the book. And there was nothing else that said Dixie except the title page and the cover of the book. And then later they put a new book out called the New Dixie Cookbook that had more recipes in it. But this is a book that had a 40-year publishing history after it was issued as a community cookbook. And I love these because this is a book that's mimicking a comb binding. There's no comb binding on these books. That's just printed. It's a decoration that looks, they're trying to make them look like community cookbooks. Once again, lending a little bit of authenticity and trustworthiness to the books from the Royal Baking Powder Company. Again, going back in a different direction. This is one of the books I have that's bound in asbestos. Actually, this is from the Order of the Eastern Star in Saco, Maine, which is just over the bridge from my old place in Biddeford. This is a book that there is a comb binding, but they didn't have the plastic combs, and so they used yarn in order to bind the books. And this is another example where I have 2 copies of this. So it shows that this was actually done by the issuer, not by somebody who was fixing the book later on after the comb binding broke off. There's a linoleum one. This is clearly just the kind of like binding rings you could get at the stationery store and sheets of linoleum. I think it's actually kind of beautiful. There's your oilcloth. This book I've got several copies of. The nice thing is they used all different kinds of oilcloth. So there's one that has apples, there's another that has tulips, there's this one. Okay, so enough with that. So another piece of effectiveness is recorded foodways, just the value that these books have to us as people interested in culinary history, as people looking for recipes from the past. A lot of these books were in many states, the earliest printed cookbook was a community cookbook. Many, and not in Boston, not in Massachusetts, not in New York, not in Pennsylvania or DC or Virginia, but in Alabama, in Maine, and in Louisiana. And this is the first Louisiana cookbook, the first New Orleans cookbook, and the first Creole cookbook. People often call that Lafcadio Hearn book, which is called Cuisine Creole. They'd say that that's the first. It's not, and I also would be willing to say it's not Lafcadio Hearn, but this one is, and this is a community cookbook put out by the ladies of a local church. What's interesting is there were 3 Louisiana cookbooks that came out the same year. This book published in Louisiana, the Lafcadio Hearn, well, what's called the Lafcadio Hearn book, which was published in New York City, and a third book called The Unrivaled Cookbook by Mrs. Washington, and Mrs. Washington is a pseudonym. We don't know who she was. Also published in New York. All 3 books were sizable cookbooks, 200 to 400 pages each, and they were all published the same year. Why? Because it was the year of the Southern States Exposition in Atlanta, and these big World's Fairs, of which this was one of them, were incredible opportunities to sell these cookbooks. I also think it's the place that so many people got the idea to go home to their town and make one of these to raise money for their causes. They'd gather from all over the country at a World's Fair in Philly or Buffalo or Atlanta, and then head home with new ideas, including how to publish a cookbook and raise some funds. My dog is snoring. I'm sorry about that. the Texas cookbook. This is the first cookbook published in Texas. This is Houston, Texas, in 1883. Again, that the material that's recorded in these books is amongst the most important evidence of American culinary culture. Sometimes, not every community cookbook is like this, but the ones that are very early for specific places like these books are priceless in terms of the value of the recipes. Beyond the recipes, they're also documenting the communities they're in. They do that through the ads. They do that through the names of the women and others who contributed the recipes to the compiled book. But some of them have external things. This is a book from San Clemente in California, just outside of LA, and it was called the Wisteria Town. And it's basically a real estate prospectus in the form of a community cookbook. And it's got these beautiful pictures of gardens. It's got some pictures of like developments that have been laid out. And this is from the early 1920s. It's also beautifully printed. Some of the pages are pink, some of them are lavender. I think that's supposed to be wisteria color. But the idea that a community cookbook could also be a real estate prospectus is a pretty neat thing. And this is a book that always sort of, I feel very strongly about. It's not an uncommon book. You can find these because it's still in print today. It was first printed in the 1940s, and it was a cookbook done by the students of the Shishmaref Day School in Shishmaref, Alaska, which is above the Arctic Circle. And it was to raise funds for an orphanage in Juneau, Alaska, in the big city. So these were kids in a very tiny town in again, north of the Arctic Circle, raising money for kids from the big city in Alaska, which is extra generous, I think. It's an extremely detailed and authentic, for a word that we often don't like to use in culinary circles these days, but these recipes, and here we have the outside of ugruk small intestine, ugruk flippers, seal oil, etc. And these are all children, young kids supplying these recipes. There's an interesting essay, short essay by the teacher in the front where the students say, who's going to eat? Nobody wants to eat these Eskimo recipes. These are for us, not for anybody else. And they said, no, let's do this and record it. So they recorded it. The reason that this book is so important to me is that Shishmaref is a town we may have heard of. And we may have heard of it because it's the town that always gets trotted out to show how climate change is destroying certain towns. And Shishmaref does not exist anymore. It exists in name because they've built another town somewhere far away. But this was a town that in the last 20 years is now under the ice or under the water. I don't know which, but it's not there. But they're still publishing the book from the new town. So this is just kind of a summary of these things, and I won't go through them too much, but I just want to say that I hope that you can see how these books are eccentric in that because they were produced by these groups of people outside of the publishing world, when they lost the normal community aspects in terms of printing and publishing, they were forced to go DIY. Some of them went to the big jobbers, but many of them were forced to really play with the materiality of the book. The way the pictures are made is another whole thing. When you're, before the DIY piece of this happens, you get books where the illustrations are usually just the picture of the church steeple. Maybe there's a photo reproduction of the pastor. Afterwards, you get people who can draw directly on the Mimeo or Ditto sheet of paper, and all of a sudden they're illustrating, this is, here's Mrs. Smith cooking this thing, or here's a pot and pan with a duck walking across the top of the page. There's all of a sudden all of these degrees of constraint in terms of illustration are removed, and they're allowed to sort of illustrate what they want, even if it seems more primitive than the very beautiful photo engraving of the steeple or the church. It raised funds for their causes. It had a significant impact on the built environment. It helped fund many of the social movements of the time, earned the respect of national advertisers, left a creative legacy, and documented their communities. And I know that probably the piece people don't quite believe the most is the effectiveness of fundraising and how much money was really raised. And except for the fact that the research on that is tedious, too tedious for me. I know that I could speak for 2 hours on that subject of how much money they raised and how it's documented. But the rest of it is I think self-evident. Something else that deserves an entire talk someday when we get further along in this project, my research partner and I, is I believe that community cookbooks are the center of American cookbook history. I don't think that they're marginal. I think they're different. I think they're created on the margins, but I think that the impetus to create them and the centrality of these books to American communities is in many ways has had like the largest impact on American cookbook history. They're late to the game. They only start in 1870, and we've had American cookbooks since, well, 1842, or I'm sorry, 1742 or 1796, depending on how you want to call that. But they're late to the game, but I think that you can find elements of community cookbooks far earlier than the community cookbooks themselves, and I'll show you one. And I think that they had an impact on some of the books that we would never think of as community cookbooks. I actually am really sorry I didn't have a slide in. There's so many illustrations I could have put in this instead of the ones I did, but one of the slides I would want to show you was the Settlement Cookbook, which is a incredibly important cookbook with roots in a Jewish settlement house in Milwaukee. And yet that book, has been almost in continuous print since then. But I'll just show you two things as examples here. This is the first. This is one of the editions. This is the Paraclete Potter Poughkeepsie 1815 edition of Amelia Simmons' American Cookery. In all the early editions, to a certain point, the author is identified as an American orphan. And in the short preface, the target audience is American orphans. So I would say that there is an identified community, even if the recipes are not drawn from that community. They're drawn from rather famous other cookbooks around the world, actually. And that there is a specific purpose for this book that is charitable. And that is that this book was intended to give skills to young people who found themselves as orphans in America. The definition of orphan is slightly different from what we think of today, but it had the same effect. And people who wanted to work in homes, and this would add a set of skills to what they might already have and give them better chance for employment and perhaps better chance for a higher wage. And I always like to compare copies of this book if I'm talking in the shop. I'll always show them a copy of Amelia Simmons if I have one. I actually have a damaged one, which I use as my demo copy. But I like to show them this and then compare it with a copy of a book from roughly 1800 from France and roughly 1800 from England and say, look at these books. Look at who the authors are. Look at what the binding tells you. You don't have to know anything about the book. The binding is aristocratic, or it's at very least sort of sort of haute bourgeois, and so the audience is different. The person doing the cooking is a professional chef aimed at royalty or aristocratic people. And the materials, the size, the illustration, everything else shows you just how different America was at the time as a brand new nation. So our very first American cookery book, I would contend, has elements that form a ground that form a place on which to build the rest of American cookbook history. And then there's this book. This is Irma Rombauer's Joy of Cooking. This is the true first edition, the 1931 self-published edition, in the jacket that was designed by her sister. And this book is a book nobody would think is a community cookbook, but there are many elements of the production of this book that are absolutely, I think that she saw the example of community cookbooks and went with it. And it's a single author book, but here are a couple things. Number one, after her husband died and she was looking for things to do, she went and was teaching cooking classes in a church basement. That's a kind of interesting connection there. The recipes in this book, to begin with, were recipes drawn from what she was teaching in the church basement. When it came time to produce the book physically, she took the text of the book to a friend of her father's who had a printing company that printed the liners for shoe boxes, you know, the kind of paper with the name of the brand on it stuffed into a shoebox. She'd never published a book before and said, could you do this? And she's asked if he'd do it, and he did it. So it was produced by a local printer binder who didn't necessarily have book experience. It's a little bit eccentric in terms of its physical production. And when it came time to distribute this book, she put together a small army of her friends who went door to door and sold it. And I think that the model of pulling recipes together, self-publishing, using whatever you can find in terms of the actual who's going to produce the book physically, and then distributing it yourself, is a model that she saw in the, at that time already, you know, quite old and robust community cookbook world. And I don't think that this book would exist if she hadn't seen that model and seen that it was possible for someone to self-publish a book. I will say that in almost every way, this is a gorgeous book. It is there's almost nothing wrong with this book in terms of its physicality. It's a sturdy book, except for the dust jacket, which is printed on tissue thin paper, which is why it's so rare. The book is a rare book. The dust jacket is much, much more rare. And that design, that typeface, that's a typeface called Cassandra, which was only invented in France a couple of years prior to the publication of this book. How did that typeface make it all the way to St. Louis in a couple of years? I have no idea, but it's interesting nonetheless. And it's one of the most beautiful book designs of a jacket in the 20th century, I think. So anyway, I just want to leave you with that idea that these books, they are a distinct category. It's a genre that has a real definition. There are outliers, but most of the books have those three elements that we talked about. I think that it's had a huge impact on the way that cooking recipes move around in America, although that's not the newest thing about them. They in a lot of ways, they mimic the way books were assembled in the medieval times and in early modern Europe. You know, the way that recipes would sort of flow freely and then be assembled into a book. But they're strong and they're weird, and that's why I like them so much. So I hope that's I'm open to any questions about these, and I could talk about them for much too long. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Don. I see we have a couple of questions already lined up in the chat room that we'll get to in just one second. I heard you use two terms that people who don't deal with books or collect books might not be familiar with. And I wonder if you give a quick definition. One was wrapper, the other was saddle stapled. Okay.
So in the regular world, we refer to books as paperbacks and hardbacks. In the antiquarian book world, we say a book is in cloth and it's in a dust jacket, if it has a dust jacket. If a book is if a book is a paperback, we would call it wrappered. It's a distinction. You'll find lots of bookseller records use those wrapper and dust jacket interchangeably, but they're not, they shouldn't be, they're different. When a paper, I'll say paperback book is created, a wrappered book is created, there are lots of ways of attaching the wrapper or the paperback, the flexible cover, to the text block, which is the part of the book that's well, it's the text, it's the block of the book with the text printed on it. And one of them is, if a book is thin enough, you can staple it. And a saddle stapler just holds a book in a sort of V shape and then runs a regular staple into it. And it's a rather quick way to produce a lot of booklets fast, especially if it's fewer than, say, 32 pages or something. But people sew them, they staple them, some of them are glued. Later on, you have what's called perfect binding, which is a terrible word because it's the least perfect type of binding. It's just loose glue. And the other, no, that was it, right? That was wrappered and saddle stapled. Yep.
Okay, and we've got several questions in the chat room. First was Judy Mazza said, it never occurred to me that community cookbooks are uniquely American. Why do you think other countries didn't create any? And are they more or less likely to be published in today's time?
Well, first I'll say that there are community cookbooks in other nations. Most of them are English-speaking countries. So you have community cookbooks in South Africa and Australia and England and Canada, obviously. But they're not nearly the percentage of the cookbooks made. I would argue that community cookbooks are the second most common genre of cookbook, and the first most common genre is product books. And that what we think of as regular cookbooks is number 3 or 4. And I mean, community cookbooks, there are probably over 100,000 titles. And it just doesn't stop. I mean, even today, there are lots of with all the digitization and recipes online and stuff, community cookbooks continue to be made. And that's because it's an effective fundraiser. People want to buy this book that's got their friends' names in it, friends and family and whatnot. And they like having it as a record of whatever it is, their church group or whatever, and they like that the money is going to go to something local. So it continues even with all of the pressure from the sort of anti real book world. It's not an anti-real book world, but the things that threaten the real book world. Does that answer? And there are indeed some in other countries. I've never seen a French one. I've seen a German one, or a couple, but again, they're just not. It's an unusual thing. It's not like it's an anomaly as opposed to a movement.
Okay. C.C. Williamson made a comment that actually I think is a question. She said, many modern community cookbooks I've seen publish the same recipes that are not from local sources. For example, tuna casserole, spinach dip, etc. To me, this detracts from the local appeal of a community cookbook. I think that might refer to the fact that I've noticed the same thing, and I wondered, is this something that happened when the community cookbook publishing industry in the Midwest began, that we suddenly see the publisher having a block of recipes that could either fill out or become the basis of a cookbook that could be added to by the local community?
That's a part of it, and those big publishers in the Midwest. And it's strange that there still isn't like a decent name for them. Like I used to call them jobbers, but they're not really job printers. But there were you have a menu you could choose from with them. You could send them everything. You could send them the recipes, the illustrations, the design for the cover, and everything, and they just print it. Or you could, and there were other add-ins like measurements and stuff like that they might add, and you'd pay a little extra for those things. On the other end, you could pay them, and all they do is put the name of your organization on it and maybe write an intro. You supply an intro, and the rest of it is all entirely supplied by them. But the compiling of recipes from outside one's community, or of recipes that originated outside one's community, goes way back before this. And if you look at Amelia Simmons, there's some really amazing work that actually traces where every single recipe in Amelia Simmons comes from. Most of them come from English cookbooks. There are a couple that come from, well, what am I saying? They all come from English cookbooks. There are a couple that were done that are untraceable and therefore are credited to Amelia Simmons. But most of them come from Eliza Smith and Suzanne. Most of the biggest contributors, Susanna Carter and Hannah Glass, and the big English cookbooks that were available in America at the time. There's a really interesting book that was published in a couple of different places in America in the late 18, I'd say 85, 86. And it has an odd name that I'm not remembering, but it's the only book I've ever seen where they credit every single recipe to its original source. And it's fascinating because the recipes are from cookbooks from all over America, from newspapers and magazines all over America. Some of the things were only published a couple years before this, so they had to make it one of the first time I saw this book, it was from Buffalo. And so that Lafcadio Hearn book I mentioned, that had to make it all the way to Buffalo. And then somebody thought it was good enough to include it in the recipes. The recipes are the least local part of community cookbooks. And I say that, and it's not disparaging in the least. It's really interesting to see how the recipes move around, where they come from, where they go, how quickly they move around, because that's the way that most, I mean, and Bruce knows this, but I've been fortunate enough to spend some real time with some really great manuscript cookbooks. And the longer time you spend with manuscript cookbooks, the more you realize that they're compiled as they are compiled. And then later on, somebody might take it and reorganize it into sections. And then maybe they republish it, they rewrite it again for another relative. They go through generations. Each time there are elements of refinement added to it, just organizing it by section. Originally, most of them are just whatever they got, they put it in there. And it's because they're getting these recipes from all different sources. A visitor to the house, they go to somebody else's house and they say, I really like that chocolate cake recipe. Mrs. Smith gives them the chocolate cake recipe from Better Homes and Gardens magazine, and it goes into their book as Mrs. Smith's chocolate cake. That's very common. And there's nothing, the lack of originality, I think, is not, I mean, looking at these things historically, I think it's fascinating and not in any way bad. But it is a mistake to assume that these things represent local foodstuffs or local food traditions in some very complete way. I don't think they do. I think they're one view in to local food traditions, but only one window. I got interested a couple of years ago in, I don't do a lot of research on the history of recipes, because I know a lot of other people who do that. And I'm really interested in the book as a material object, as an artifact, as an historic messenger from the past, if you will. And in working on that Maine community cookbook, I was writing these little blurbs about various recipes, and I had written, and these were all coming from like older Maine cookbooks, cookbooks from Maine from the 1870s and 80s and 1920s and whatnot. And I got to the very last one, and it was a recipe for a Bangor brownie from 1915 or something. And I thought, well, maybe I'll write something about the actual recipe this time. And I looked up, but I realized I didn't know anything about the history of the brownie. I looked it up in a number of encyclopedias, the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Food and Drink, Andy Smith's massive tome, which is great most of the time, and some others. And in every case, there was an entry for brownie, and the entry said something like, well, there's this rumor that it comes from Maine, but it really comes from Massachusetts, and it was the Lowney's cookbook of 1915 or whatever that was the introduction of this thing. And it was very offhand. And I'm thinking, somebody got paid to write this entry. This is really kind of weak. Then they should have done more research. And I don't frankly care if the recipe comes from Maine or not. I don't, I'm not trying to prove that it's a Maine thing. But I've now spent all this time looking at American cookbooks, and every book that I look at prior to 1915, I look for a brownie recipe. And some of them are really fascinating. Just a couple weeks ago, I was cataloging this. This is the Hawaiian Cookbook. This is the 5th edition of 1909. And in its original publication, of which I believe there's no copy known of the one from the 1870s, but there are 3 of the one from the 1880s. In the 4th and 5th edition, and thankfully there was a digital copy of the 4th, there's a recipe for the Bangor brownie. And it's in a Hawaiian cookbook in 1909. This is like, 6 years prior to the one that they're quoting as the source. And then I look up the woman who supplied the recipe for the Bangor brownie, and she's Mrs. Edwin O. Hall. And I thought, well, Mrs. Edwin O. Hall of Honolulu, where the book is published, that's a pretty decent Google search, right? It's narrow enough. And sure enough, Edwin O. Hall was the grandson of the first printer in the Sandwich Islands, missionary from Massachusetts. And then his grandson, Edwin O. Hall, goes to Harvard, meets a woman from Maine, Mrs. Edwin O. Hall. They moved back to Honolulu, but they traveled back and forth to Maine all the time. And so this Bangor brownie recipe got picked up by her sometime in probably, 07, 08, 09, somewhere in there. And so we have a little piece of earlier brownie history. And there's another one I have from a Maine book, but the woman was the wife of a very wealthy timberman. And she spent her winters in San Antonio, Texas, which is why the Maine cookbook from 1910 that she privately published book, wasn't a community book, contains 24 Mexican recipes, which is incredibly early for Mexican recipes to not be in a book from Texas or California. And including the Bangor brownie and a brownie that was called the Mexican brownie, which was the same thing with a dash of Gephardt's chili pepper in it. So, now you even have like differential styles of brownie that precede the one that's being quoted in the history books so far. So I'm just going to keep going, hoping I keep finding them as I go backwards, and maybe it'll find its roots somewhere that has nothing to do with Maine at all, but it's a fun little project.
Okay. By the way, I think I have that Hawaiian cookbook from 1888.
That's a great book.
I'm running an inventory along the side of your talk. Let's see. Linda Calvin asked about the cover on The Joy of Cooking, and it's kind of a modern art piece. Is it a woman slaying a dragon with a mop, and why does she have a purse and a halo?
That's Saint Martha of Bethany, and she's that in New Testament, that she would be Mary, the mother of Jesus's sister, who shows up in those very early chapters about the nativity. And there's one piece of this that I find very confusing, but this is the reality of the story. Saint Martha of Bethany is known in southern France to have slain a tarasque, which is a type of dragon, which is what that is showing. She also, not in the south of France, but everywhere, is the patron saint of kitchen workers. So this is I think it's supposed to be a housewife slaying this dragon. And I think it was Anne Mendelsohn who called her slaying the dragon of kitchen drudgery or something like that. But yeah, it's a fabulous image. It's very Art Deco. It's beautiful, and it's completely confusing that she's carrying a purse and a mop. But that's what it is, and it is a very specific Provençal dragon.
Thank you.
Sure.
Laura Gilliam says she has 2 questions, but wants to ask them live rather than type. So Laura, I believe you have to unmute yourself.
It says I'm unmuted. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I hear you. Yes.
Yes. A quick question about Joy of Cooking. Probably 30 years ago, Alan Stepnick of Second Story Books had a mimeographed set of recipes from Irma Rumbecker, and it was said to be the precursor of Joy of Cooking. I certainly didn't have the $1,000 at the time to buy it. But is that true that this was made for her cooking classes at the church you mentioned?
Yeah, I've heard of that. I've never seen it. If I saw it come up for sale for $1,000, I'd buy it.
Right.
It's interesting. The first time I bought a copy, oh wait, no, that's a different person. Never mind. I did the first Joy of Cooking I ever saw with a jacket, and that I bought with a jacket did come from Washington, D.C., by the way. That was interesting.
Uh-huh.
I've heard that there is a precursor that was a mimeograph thing, and off the top of my head, I'm not remembering what it is right now. I have a note in my database, but it is something that was produced for the classes in the church.
At the
So
classes, okay. He
Yeah.
did make a copy of the title page for me, and if I could ever find it,
I'd love to see it just
I'll send it to
my
you.
database. Yeah.
Right.
Excuse me for interrupting, but that mimeographed book is mentioned in the biography of Irma Ronbauer. I think it may have been Anne Applebaum that wrote it. It's called Stand Facing the Stove.
Yeah, it's Ann Mendelsohn. Yeah.
And Mendelsohn. Well,
Okay.
it's mentioned in there, and at the time she'd written that book, the family had never been able to find a copy of it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think that's right. I think that's where I found out about it was through Anne. There's another book that the famous Chinese cookbook by Bu Wei Chan
Uh-huh.
that's considered the first really like thoughtful American Chinese cookbook.
Yeah, I have one of the very late reprints.
And that there was a tiny little book called The Philosophy of Chinese Food that was put out as before that book came out. And I sold it to an institution, and I told Ann where it went. But when Ann got in touch with me and said, nobody's ever seen that. And I was like, that's great, but this is where you can go see it now. But there, so many books, there are these little precursor things that exist, but they're super rare. I'd love to see that. I hope it's gone to an institution. I'm going to probably run a WorldCat search when we get off this call and see if it's shown up in an institution.
Right. Yeah. I'd like to see it too. My other question are cookbooks made for historical properties or park service properties, which I have a number that have the big, thick wooden covers with pictures that are now totally incorrect in a sense, but they seem to be, some of them seem to be collections done specifically for that park or that area of the country or that particular historical property. Would you call those community cookbooks, or they're just one of those in between?
I think that some of those books could be community cookbooks. It depends a lot on how the two pieces that I think are probably or would often be missing from that would be that the books were drawn from the community, because the community of the national, I'm not sure I would know what that community might be.
Some seem to be.
And so then they would then have
the others seem to be drawn from a long, I have one on southern, I can't remember where I picked it up, but they list it's Confederate cooking. So it is from, quite a number, and some of those are drawn from community cookbooks. It's only listed at the end of the book, not individually. This comes from such and such.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some of them probably are technically community cookbooks. Some of them are kind of close, but not exactly.
Right.
There are other books that are, also, they're single author books or single compiler books that don't indicate, and they don't have to be attributed. You just have to know that they actually gathered them from in a community. And also, is there a charitable purpose? Well, if it's supporting the park or the
it is
site, then that's a charitable purpose.
Right. Yeah, it does fit that. Yeah. Right.
There are some other categories of books that are within community cookbooks that I think are fascinating. Most of them are technically community cookbooks, but they have one of them is expat books. And expat books take lots of forms. They could be missionary books, they could be military family books, think the first one I ever had was it was called like the uh, Petroleum Women's Club, and they were the wives of like executives of oil companies moving around the world to Indonesia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and in the 1940s. And they've actually put out more than one book, but there was an early one from the 1940s or maybe early 50s. And families at like the big mining sites in Latin America. The military base books can be very
Oh,
interesting,
yeah,
and
right.
they're definitely a type of community book. And the cool thing about them is that they have this dual purpose. They welcome somebody in. When somebody comes to the base, they move on to the base with their military spouse, and then if they're welcomed into the spouse community with a copy of the cookbook that was put out recently.
Oh,
When they leave, they also take the cookbook with them, and it becomes they're looking forward in one way and backward in the other, and
yeah,
it's neat.
yeah.
Expat books are fascinating, and they're also the missionary ones in particular are often some of the earliest and in many cases very rare cookbook, like the Nanking cookbook, which is a Hong Kong. Is it Hong Kong or Shanghai? I think it's Hong Kong book, which is a missionary group in Hong Kong, and that's a really rare and important book because it's coming out super early in the history of Western interpretations of Chinese food.
Right.
The very first sub-Saharan African cookbook printed in sub-Saharan Africa is a missionary book, and there's only one copy known, and I bought and sold. That's at Michigan State now,
Oh,
and that book was from the Congo, tiny little book from a town called Loango, I think, and the town actually was a famous market town in the Congo. So there were lots and lots of fruits and vegetables in the book that get named, which sometimes these missionary books are just like hot dogs and mac and cheese. Like there's nothing in it that's
right.
about the place. But this one had some really good stuff.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for teaching me the term comb. I call
Oh
it.
yeah, it's a some
I can't stand them. They drive me nuts. But
well,
anyway.
booksellers hate them, and
Right.
I was guilty of that too, and I don't love them. Partially because most of them don't have any info on the spines. You can't put it on the shelf facing out if you're trying to sell it to the general public.
Right.
Um, and they get brittle and break, and
Yeah.
they're frustrating.
Yep.
And it's not my favorite physical manifestation of the community cookbook because there's so many. I mean, including the ones that have metal spirals and on other. There's a whole taxonomy of these that has yet to be done, and that's actually to partially answer Bruce's question earlier. We've cataloged so the 6 volume. It's projected to be 6 volumes. We've only published one. The second and it's alphabetical by state, and then chrono within each state. And it's not complete. It's like, there'll be like 50 entries for a state. And the idea is to show the arc of the history of the community cookbook in each state the best way we can. And some of them are very consistent, like Connecticut, it's all Methodist or Congregationalist. It's very consistent. There aren't that many groups. California, also in the volume with C, like there's like so many different types of groups. It's just like this gigantic mixture of social and political and religious groups represented. So we've completed cataloging up through M, and which is 3 more volumes. But we've had a lot of trouble getting the intros done, and for reasons I won't mention here. But actually, my partner on this is a guy named Mark Germer, who's a retired special collections librarian from the University of Pennsylvania. And Mark can't let a thread, just go. He's got to follow the thread. And he wrote the intro to volume 2, which we would have out now, and it was 53 pages long. And
Oh my.
for a bookseller catalog to be have a 53-page intro, that's even a bit much for me, and I'm kind of notorious for that kind of thing. And he submitted the essay, we agreed he should submit it to the Bibliographic Society of America. And they wrote back and said, too many footnotes. And when the Bibliographical Society of America says you have too many footnotes, you know you have too many footnotes. So we're working on it, but I think what we're going to put in volume 2 instead of the giant essay is a taxonomy of the bindings of community cookbooks, which will have all the different kinds of bindings and all the wire and the wire-o and the double wire-o and the spiral and yeah, there's dozens of them, and it's kind of cool that nobody's bothered to do it yet. Like Brian Cassidy, the bookseller down in Maryland, has done a fabulous work with the history of Mimeo and Ditto and that kind of stuff. He's the guy for that. And, Bruce asked me a question before we started this talk, and I'm happy to answer that if you want to ask the question again, Bruce. So
it was basically what's the connection between starting with modern books with an emphasis on avant-garde and antiquarian books?
Yeah. So I started bookselling in big general use shops. I mean, I worked for both. I worked for Powell's in Chicago for a long time and managed one of their shops there, and I worked for the Strand Rare Book Room for a while. But slowly my specialty became modern, sort of like modern thought, which would be philosophy and psychology and stuff, but also historical avant-garde. And there actually is a whole tradition of antiquarian bookselling of that material. So like Dada, Surrealism, and Futurism, and Constructivism. And one of the things I loved about that material was the materiality of it, the fact that they used loads of odd materials, they used loads of odd techniques of printing, of binding, and there are those beautiful like big metal futurist big futurist books that have like giant metal hinges, and there were books that had that were bound in weird materials and used every kind of printing technology you could imagine. You want to print with potatoes and potato stamping, that's fine. So the stuff was very, it was exciting to work with because you could see all these different kinds of printing and binding and illustration and whatnot. When I started collecting the community cookbooks, I had this artificial cutoff of 1945. And that was just because I felt like, and this is speaking to one of the questions we had earlier, I felt like after 1945, there were pretty much all these plastic comb binding books produced in the Midwest. They were less local, etc. But because I buy collections all at once, I'd get these books that were post 1945. And I started to realize that there weren't just these books from the Midwestern publishers. There were all these ones that's where I saw the DIY stuff. And once I saw the DIY stuff and people were binding books using nuts and bolts and asbestos and linoleum and metal and cardboard. I have a book where this was actually this is an aftermarket binding, but it's a community cookbook, and it's a book that there's no other known copy of this Pennsylvania book from the 1890s. And somebody cared so much about this book that they bound it in corrugated cardboard, and the hinges were made from Band-Aids. And the Band-Aids weren't just regular Band-Aids. They were camouflage pattern Band-Aids with little skulls and crossbones. And it's the most hilarious looking thing. But the person really cared about this book because they actually produced a digital copy of the book that I found online, which is how I reconnected with the person. But there's only one copy of this book known, and it's this crazy copy that has like these wacky Band-Aids to hold it together. And it wouldn't be my choice for binding, but there's a sort of like acceptance of oddity because they lived outside of the regular world. And I like to see things that are printed differently, bound differently, illustrated in a strange way that you wouldn't expect. And I don't think I would have recognized, I wouldn't have been as excited about that stuff if I hadn't had the exposure to the avant-garde material. And I would also say that I think community cookbooks have embraced more types of printing, binding, and material sources than any other type of book known to man, except for artist books. And that's because artist books purposely go out there and try to be weird. And I think that's a good thing. But I'm just saying, like, they're out there trying to use whatever oddball materials they can find. Community cookbooks are this way because they were trying to solve a problem. They were trying to get these things done so they could raise the money.
It's interesting. We have a couple of comments and I guess, two questions and a couple of comments. Cece, you had a question about Charleston receipts. And what was the oldest Virginia cookbook? So let's take those. And then Linda Calvin has a comment. So
What was the question about Charleston receipts?
would you comment on it? And then what is the oldest Virginia cookbook? The oldest Virginia community cookbook? So Charleston receipts first.
I'll tell you, the problem with answering these questions is like I can't pull my database up at the same time we talk.
Actually, you can't.
Okay.
If you're on a Windows computer.
Oh, if I stop share, right?
Pardon?
If I stop share, so you don't see the.
Actually, well, I don't know about you, but I'm on a Windows machine and I can move Zoom over to half the machine with the Windows key and the arrow key.
So the
Windows plus the left arrow or Windows plus the right.
I'm good. I'm in my database now, so. So I'm not sure why I don't. I mean, the Charleston receipts book. I don't know that I have a tremendous amount to say about it. I mean, I think that. I think you have. I think the only time I've sold a first, I think, went to you. So it might have been the only one I've ever handled.
I don't think so because I don't have it.
You don't have a first. You only have you have the second.
I don't even have a title.
And it's the Kentucky Housewife is the one that everybody seems to be unable to find. Not the 1886 one, there's a much earlier one. Yeah, there's the Carolina Housewife that's 1847, that's later. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have anything to add about about that book. I mean, if it's one of these things that if it's not on my, if it's something I haven't handled, I don't have a lot of knowledge of it. In terms of the earliest Virginia community cookbook, we haven't cataloged Virginia because it's at the end of the alphabet. And so I mean, this collection is like 10,000 books. So it's just like, it goes forever.
If it's the same if the first charitable would be the same, it would be the same as the first community.
Yeah. I mean,
then it would be the Confederate cookbook from the early 1860s.
Yeah.
Which is one that I would love to get my hands on it, but I doubt I'll ever see it.
Yeah, and there is a facsimile of that. That's if you don't have it, I'll just send it to you because I have a couple of them. But it's that's a super rare book. The Kentucky Housewife, the early one, the one from the 20s or 30s, is also super rare. And the Charleston Receipts is very rare. It's a very good book. Okay, I'm sorry I don't have more to add to that, but anything else? Any other questions, Bruce?
Okay. Linda Calvin had a comment.
Oh, the Southern Peru Copper Company. Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. The thing about the shipment. Yeah, they're all it's an example of an expat community cookbook. And for when a shipment hadn't come in yet. So if you arrived there, you'd get this sort of this book, and hopefully it would help you a bit in the meantime. I mean, it sounds fascinating because of that. That's the thing that would, because it gives you this little bit of information about how these people's lives work that I might not have ever thought of before. There's a book I just cataloged a couple of days ago called the Wartime West Indies Cookbook, and it's from 1942 in Barbados. And the recipes are actually very local and very interesting. And they're using all sorts of fruits and vegetables, and there's some meat stuff in there. Although it's wartime and they're discouraging people from eating meat. But the thing that's so interesting is that the ads in there, and there are a lot of them, seem to be aimed at like 2 or 3 different groups of people. Like some of the ads are for tourists. So this is wartime, World War II era people going to Barbados on vacation. And there are ads for things that are hotels and places to dine and dance and whatnot. And then there are ads for electric stoves and housewares for other people who presumably have moved there. And I think all of the people are I'll say they're non-local to Barbados. But you can, it gives you this other whole look at what was going on in the Caribbean at that very moment. There are also all the hotel ads said no blackouts, meaning that if you're in this hotel, that hotel still has light all day long. And it's little tiny things like that I look for in these books that give us the better sense of exactly what's going on in the place that the book is about. So, I'm going to put up where's my screen share? It's not showing up. Oh, here it is. So can everybody see this book that I just put up here? Nantucket Receipts.
Yep.
Oh, I did show this earlier. I had it on a different slide, and I thought maybe that I hadn't shown it, but I did show that. That's the beginning of them all. Something I didn't mention, when I talked about the fact that that I had this arbitrary cutoff of 1945, and then eventually I expanded it. Basically the rule for expanding for me, because if I took every community cookbook I came across, I'd be buried in them. But the rule for expanding to accept a book post 1945 was that it had to have one of 2 things. The material book had to be interesting in some way. So it might be odd materials or whatever, like I've talked about already. It might also be that it represents a community group or social organization in America that I hadn't seen before. And one of the things that these books do really, really well, and I'm looking forward to the day when more and more of them are digitized so that we can actually, kind of navigate our way through them using, big data searches, like, sort of advanced Google stuff, is the changes in groups. Like it starts out being Grange halls and churches and hospital auxiliaries, and it ends up being, the women's hockey club the hockey club booster women's auxiliary, and the marching band of the high school women's auxiliary, or auxiliary in general. Or I have one for the Maine Caged Bird Fanciers Society, so people who had parakeets and parrots and the like. And I have them for motorcycle gangs and motorcycle clubs and insurance salesmen, and on and on and on. And so for people who study things like American social organizations, and there was a famous book called Bowling Alone that came out about 15 years ago about how American social organizations were kind of falling apart, that people didn't join a bowling league, but when you look at the community cookbooks, you can actually see maybe it's just smaller particles. Maybe there are more organizations. It's not the same old ones there used to be. They're just different now. And the community books represent them really, really well. I think it's, for some historian, they're going to be able to go really deep on this and look at American cultural history in a different way. Not because of the recipes, but because of the types of groups that put these things out.
in a way, that is what happened to manuscript cookbooks as institutions began to realize that they did all of those things as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've finished up all of the questions and comments that were in the chat. So I'll say going once, going twice for anybody that wants to quick dive in and ask a question live. I don't see any takers. Don, we've got a couple of very short business things to cover, which you're more than welcome to stick around for if you want. But if not, I'd like to thank you very much for an interesting talk. For me, it's always great to hear about what's going on with cookbooks. And I was particularly interested in your definition of a community cookbook, because I've always felt that was a little undefined, and it's nice to have a way of actually categorizing them as opposed to other sorts of things.
Thank you. And it's good because then you can, you'll see things and recognize them as outliers, which is, it's good to see the outliers and how they're partially community cookbooks, but not entirely. Well, I mean, thank you so much again for inviting me to do this. And it's been a pleasure and really great questions. And I hope that this was informative. I'm a little sorry the pictures were in a sort of odd order for the way that I was presenting, but I hope you enjoyed them nonetheless.
Very nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to bow out now, but good luck with the rest of your meeting. Thank you and take care.
Okay. Let's see. I think the next thing is whether there are any announcements that people would like to make to the group. CC, you did forward one from Claire, but I've held it until announcements. And I see Claire is not with us. So would you like to let the group know what that was about?
Bruce, I typed everything into the chat, so if you just read that, it's the best.
Okay. Anybody else have an announcement? No? Also going once, going twice? No. All right.
Why don't you read aloud what was in the chat so not everybody accesses the chat fluently. Why don't you just go ahead and just read what CC wrote?
Claire Cassidy sent the word that there is a May 8th White House Food History Symposium at Decatur House. And it's an all-day, that must be a Saturday because it's an all-day event, co-sponsored by the White House Historical Association and the Smithsonian American History Museum. Cece's going to put details in the April CHoW line. But her initial thought was that it's free, but you have to register for it. Okay, nobody else came forward with any. I'll just note that our April meeting will be on Southern Louisiana cuisine, which sounds like it should be very interesting in addition to the delicious. And I'll add one thing that you'll hear from me periodically in these meetings. The March CHoW line gave a description of some of the things, basically what the officers and directors do to keep this organization going. Many of them have things that could easily be done by somebody else, and all of us would like to see the membership get more actively involved in running the group. There's not a lot of work that needs to be done, but what there is does need to be done, and we've been in harness for quite some time. So if you have any interest, not only in the position itself, but in any of the things that the position involves, let any of us, but particularly me or Judy's our vice president, know, and we'd be happy to get you more actively involved. We'd be delighted to have the company. And with that, I will adjourn us until our April meeting. Have a good rest of the day.